All right, so get ready because today we're diving into some pretty mind-blowing stuff.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, we're talking about global cataclysms, like seriously massive events that reshape the Earth.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Our main source, a book called The Adam and Eve Story by Chan Thomas. And get this, it was classified by the CIA until just a few years ago in 2013.
Wow, the CIA. That definitely adds a layer of mystery.
Right. So we're going to try to unpack this, look at what Thomas is proposing, the evidence he uses, and what it all might mean.
Sounds like a wild ride.
Oh, it definitely is. So to start, what exactly are we talking about here? What does Thomas say about these cataclysms?
Well, the basic idea is that Earth's history isn't this slow, gradual process we often think about.
They're more like bam, bam, bam.
Exactly. He's talking about sudden, catastrophic events that completely transform the planet. These events involve shifts in the Earth's crust, which cause the poles to move.
Wait, like the actual North and South poles moving?
Yep, imagine the North Pole suddenly ending up in, say, the Sahara Desert.
Whoa, that's a bit hard to wrap my head around. I mean, wouldn't that cause chaos?
Total chaos. We're talking massive earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, I'm starting to see where the cataclysm part comes in, but what kind of evidence does he use to support this theory? I mean, it sounds pretty out there.
It does sound dramatic, but he pulls from a lot of different areas: geology, ancient maps, even astronomy.
Okay, let's break that down. Starting with the geology, what does he see in the Earth itself that suggests these massive events?
Well, he points to formations like Niagara Falls or the Grand Canyon, arguing they weren't formed by slow erosion over millions of years.
He thinks they were created suddenly.
Yeah, by forces so powerful that they carved these massive features into the landscape almost instantly.
Okay, that's pretty wild. And what about the maps? What do they show?
Well, one really interesting map is the Piri Reis map.
Hmm.
It's from the 16th century, and it actually seems to show Antarctica.
Centuries before it was officially discovered.
Exactly. And not just that, it depicts Antarctica without its ice sheets,
Yeah.
suggesting a very different configuration of the continents way back then.
Hold on, a map showing Antarctica without ice hundreds of years before anyone knew it existed? That's definitely raising some questions.
Right, and that's where Thomas's theory comes in. He suggests that this map, and others like it, might be remnants of a lost civilization, one that existed before the last cataclysm.
A civilization that had knowledge of the Earth's true geography before it was all rearranged?
That's the idea, and it's a pretty tantalizing one.
It is, but we're only scratching the surface here. We still haven't touched on the biblical connection. You mentioned earlier that Thomas sees the story of Adam and Eve as symbolic of a cataclysm.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. He suggests that Adam represents the original mother continent, a place where civilization flourished.
And Eve represents the survivors.
Exactly, the offspring who managed to escape the devastation and carry on.
Wow, so the flood that wipes out Adam's world is the cataclysm itself.
You got it. And the serpent. Thomas sees it as a symbol of the cataclysmic event, this destructive force that brings about a sudden end to the world as they knew it.
It's a pretty radical interpretation, but it kind of makes you look at those old stories in a new light.
Right. It makes you wonder if they're not just stories, but echoes of real events, memories passed down through generations.
And it's not just the Bible, right? You mentioned that other cultures have similar myths.
Oh yeah, tons of cultures have stories about great floods, lost golden ages, advanced civilizations that were wiped out.
It's almost like a collective memory of some ancient trauma.
Exactly. It suggests that this might not just be a random biblical tale, but something much bigger, a shared human experience.
Okay, so we've got these catastrophic events, ancient maps, potential connections to myths and legends, but what actually causes these cataclysms? Like, what's the mechanism?
Well, remember, Thomas was a geophysicist, so he dives into the inner workings of the Earth, specifically the molten layers beneath the crust.
So like the magma.
Yeah, and he argues that these molten layers, combined with Earth's magnetic and electrical fields, are what drive these sudden dramatic shifts.
So it's not just about continents moving around slowly, there's this whole electromagnetic component as well.
Precisely, and it gets even more interesting because Thomas doesn't limit the explanation to forces within the Earth itself.
What do you mean?
He actually points to a trigger, something originating outside our planet that sets these events in motion.
Wait, so something from space is influencing these cataclysms?
That's what he proposes. And to find out exactly what that is, well, you'll have to stick around for part 2 of our deep dive.
Oh, you know I'm hooked. We'll be back right after the break. Okay, so we're back and ready to dive deeper into the Adam and Eve story. And I have to say, the more we learn about this book, the more intrigued I get.
It's definitely a mind bender, isn't it?
For sure. And before the break, we were talking about this idea of a cosmic trigger, something from outside Earth that sets these cataclysms in motion.
Right, remember Thomas suggests that these cataclysms happen in cycles.
Yeah, you mentioned these polar eras and how he connects them to specific locations on Earth.
Exactly. He lays out a whole timeline of these shifts, occurring roughly every 6 to 10,000 years.
And these shifts, they're not just random. He actually pinpoints where the poles might have been located in the past.
He does, and it's pretty fascinating. He talks about places like the Sudan Basin in Africa, Hudson Bay in Canada, the Caspian Sea, even Wisconsin.
Wait, Wisconsin? Like the cheese state?
Yep, he's suggesting that at some point in Earth's history, the North Pole was located in what is now the American Midwest.
Okay, now that's just wild. I mean, I can't even imagine Wisconsin being tropical, let alone having the North Pole.
It's a pretty dramatic shift, right?
Yeah.
And he goes on to connect these past polar locations to what we know about ancient history.
Like, is there any correlation between where the poles were and, say, the rise and fall of civilizations?
Well, he specifically links the last polar era, the one that he believes ended around 11,500 years ago, to the disappearance of some advanced civilizations, including Atlantis.
Oh, wow. So he's actually suggesting that the sinking of Atlantis, which a lot of people just dismiss as a myth, could have been a real event caused by one of these cataclysms.
That's his theory. And it does make you think, because so many cultures have stories about great floods or lost golden ages, times of advanced knowledge that were suddenly wiped out.
And what if those stories aren't just myths, but actual memories of a real event, a collective trauma embedded in human consciousness?
It's definitely a possibility, and it adds a whole other layer of depth to these ancient narratives.
It's like we've been looking at these stories through the wrong lens. Maybe they're not just fantastical tales, but warnings from the past.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
Mhm.
But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the actual mechanics of the cataclysm itself. How does Thomas describe what happens when the Earth's crust shifts?
Yeah, paint us a picture. What would it have been like to experience one of these events?
Well, he describes it as a series of events that unfold with incredible speed and violence. The first thing you'd experience is earthquakes, unlike anything we see today.
Like, how strong are we talking?
Strong enough to rip apart continents, shatter mountains, open up huge chasms in the earth.
So basically, magnitude 10 on the Richter scale times 1,000.
Pretty much. And as if that wasn't bad enough, you'd then have volcanic eruptions all over the planet, spewing out molten rock, ash, toxic gases, just blanketing everything in darkness.
It sounds like a scene from an apocalyptic movie.
It does. And then you've got the melting ice caps to contend with. As the poles shift, they start melting at an insane rate, causing sea levels to rise rapidly.
And that's when the massive floods hit.
Exactly. He describes tsunamis miles high, sweeping across entire continents, just obliterating everything in their path.
So it's earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, basically every natural disaster you can imagine, all happening at once.
And that's not even the worst of it. He also talks about earth fire, which is one of the most terrifying aspects of his description.
Earth fire, what is that exactly?
It's basically the Earth's molten layers, the magma beneath the crust, bursting through the surface during these cataclysms.
So not just floods and earthquakes, but also literal fire raining down from the sky.
Pretty much, he describes rivers of fire flowing across the landscape, just incinerating everything in their path.
It's like something out of a nightmare, and to think this could have happened multiple times throughout Earth's history, just wiping the slate clean and forcing life to start over.
It's a pretty humbling thought, right? It makes you wonder how anything could survive an event like that.
That's what I was thinking. What chance would anyone have?
Well, Thomas suggests that some pockets of humanity might survive, perhaps in high-altitude regions or in specially prepared shelters.
He even draws a parallel to the story of Noah's Ark, suggesting it might be a symbolic representation of a survival strategy passed down through generations.
It's an interesting interpretation, and it makes you wonder if those ancient myths are more than just stories. Maybe they're encoded memories, warnings from the past about the cyclical nature of these cataclysms.
Okay, so we've talked about what happens during these cataclysms, but I'm still curious about what triggers them in the first place. We touched on this idea of a cosmic trigger, but can you elaborate on that?
Sure, this is where Thomas's theory delves into the realm of astrophysics. He proposes that our sun, like many other stars, goes through cycles of increased energy output.
So it's not just constantly shining, it has these periods of like super activity.
Exactly, and those cycles, he argues, cause disruptions in the sun's magnetic and electrical fields, which then sends powerful shock waves throughout the solar system.
So it's not just light and heat coming from the sun, but also these powerful electromagnetic pulses.
That's the idea, and those pulses, according to Thomas, are what ultimately trigger the cataclysms on Earth.
It's fascinating to think that our planet is so connected to the activity of our star. I mean, we usually think of the sun as this constant, unchanging presence. But it seems like it plays a much more dynamic role in shaping our planet's history.
It's a reminder that we're part of a much larger system, a cosmic dance, if you will, and those forces, as Thomas argues, have shaped our past and could very well shape our future.
That's a pretty profound thought, and it brings us to the big question. If these events are cyclical, does that mean we're due for another one? And if so, what does that mean for us? Well, folks, we'll tackle those questions and more right after the break, so don't go anywhere. Of our deep dive into the Adam and Eve story.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
Yeah, we've covered some seriously mind-blowing stuff. Cataclysms, ancient maps, biblical connections, a cosmic trigger, you name it.
And now it's time to grapple with the big question, what does this all mean for us?
Right. If Chan Thomas is right and these cataclysmic events are like a recurring part of Earth's history, driven by forces way beyond our control, then what? What does that do to our understanding of, well, everything?
It challenges pretty much everything we think we know. To start with, history, our textbooks, timelines, our understanding of ancient civilizations. It could all be based on a foundation that's, well, kind of shaky.
Like we've been building a house on sand, not realizing the tide could come in and wash it all away.
Exactly. And it's not just history. Think about geology, paleontology, archaeology. All those fields are based on this idea of slow, gradual change over time.
But Thomas is saying, nope, throw all that out the window. These massive disruptions, these resets, they've got to be factored in.
Right. It's like trying to understand a movie when someone's ripped out a bunch of pages from the script.
So where do we even begin to put the pieces back together? How do we know what's real and what's, lost to these cataclysms?
It's tough, no question. But it also makes things more interesting. It forces us to question our assumptions, to be open to new interpretations.
So we got to become like history detectives, piecing together clues from ancient myths, scattered artifacts, maybe even rethinking how we read religious texts.
Exactly. It's a challenge, but it's also kind of exciting, isn't it? Uncovering these hidden layers of history.
Definitely. It's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, and each layer reveals something even more surprising.
And it's not just about understanding the past. Remember, if Thomas is right, these cataclysms aren't just something that happened a long time ago. They're a recurring phenomenon.
So the big question is, could it happen again? And if so, are we ready for it?
It's a sobering thought, right? Imagine knowing that at any moment, everything could change. The world as we know it could be completely reshaped.
Would that change how we live our lives? How we build our cities? How we think about our place in the universe?
It would have to, wouldn't it? Think about it. If you knew a massive flood was coming, you wouldn't build your house on the beach, right?
You'd probably build it on a higher ground, or maybe even design some kind of like arc to ride out the storm.
Exactly. And knowing about these cycles, it would change how we view history. We wouldn't see it as a straight line, but as a spiral, with these catastrophic resets happening every few thousand years.
It would make us realize that we're not at the pinnacle of human achievement, that civilizations might have risen and fallen countless times before us.
And that knowledge, even though it's scary, it's also empowering because it gives us a chance to prepare, to learn from the past, to maybe even avoid repeating the mistakes of those who came before us.
So what can we do right here, right now, with this information? I mean, it's a lot to take in.
Well, the first thing is just to acknowledge the possibility, to be open to the idea that our understanding of the world might be incomplete.
To be humble, to realize that we don't have all the answers, and that's okay.
Right, and to be curious, to keep asking questions, to keep exploring, to never stop learning.
Because the more we learn, the better equipped we'll be to face whatever challenges the future holds, whether it's a cataclysm or something else entirely.
Exactly. We can't control everything, but we can control how we respond to the unknown, and that's what really matters.
Well said. Chan Thomas with the Adam and Eve story has given us a lot to think about. Whether or not we agree with his theory, he's challenged us to see the world in a new light, to question our assumptions, and to be open to the possibility of a history far more complex and dramatic than we ever imagined.
It's a story that continues to unfold, a mystery that we're only beginning to unravel.
And we invite you to join us on that journey, to keep digging deeper, to keep asking questions, and to never stop searching